The Red River Shootout, a rivalry fueled by deep-seated animosity, is unique in college sports. Played at the Cotton Bowl at the Texas State Fair, the fans are split down the 50-yard line, half crimson and cream and half burnt orange, symbolizing the separation of the two fan bases by the Red River. And during the 60s, the rivals were separated by success on the football field as well. Texas won 2 national championships in the 60s and dominated the Red River Shootout. Between 1958 and 1970, Oklahoma only beat Texas once. By 1970, Oklahoma head coach Chuck Fairbanks and his entire staff were on the verge of getting fired. They were desperate, but one fateful decision would change the trajectory of the rivalry and the history of Oklahoma football forever. By 1970, Texas, behind their new Wishbone formation, was running over everyone that stood in their way. The Sooners' coaching staff saw what Texas was doing and believed they could do the same thing. As Barry Switzer put it, Texas was scoring half 100 on every team they played. They were running all over the yard, and no one could stop them. I looked at their roster and I looked at ours, and it was pretty clear we had better athletes than Texas did. So why not switch to the Wishbone? Why not indeed? Switzer was right. The Sooners did have talent. Quarterback Jack Mildren had been the top QB prospect in the state of Texas his senior year of high school. Receiver Greg Pruitt could absolutely fly. But you wouldn't know it watching them play at the beginning of 1970. The Sooners started the season running the Houston Veer, which had been pioneered by Bill Yeoman. Houston had led the NCAA in total offense 3 consecutive years. Oklahoma, however, couldn't find that same level of success. After season-opening wins against SMU and Wisconsin, Oklahoma fell to Oregon State in Game 3. That's when they made the decision. They were going to scrap their entire offense and install a brand new system in the middle of the season. One day, in the fall of 1970, Texas offensive coordinator Emory Bellard was sitting at his desk in his office on campus. Coach Royal walked into Bellard's office and in his Oklahoma drawl said, "Chuck Fairbanks and his coaches are in bad shape up in Oklahoma. They're fixin' to get fired. I want to help him. Barry Switzer will be calling you to learn about the Wishbone." Bellard couldn't believe what he had just heard. Had Coach Royal lost his mind? Was the former Sooner letting his old allegiance get in the way? Or was he simply too nice of a guy for his own good? Whatever the case, later that day, Switzer did call. In spite of his initial shock, when Switzer called, Bellard gave him every bit of information he had on the Wishbone. Oh yeah, the next game on Oklahoma's schedule was Texas. Oklahoma had a bye week, meaning they had almost 2 full weeks to try to fully implement their new system. Jack Mildren studied it in depth, learning everything he could, and Greg Pruitt was moved from receiver to halfback in order to get the ball in his hands more frequently. When game day came, the initial results were not great. Oklahoma lost the game 41-9. Clearly, Oklahoma had a long way to go. But the game wasn't necessarily as bad as it seemed. The Sooners had moved the ball. Part of the reason for the blowout was 5 Oklahoma turnovers. While the Wishbone is ideal for getting athletes out in space, it's also inherently riskier than some other schemes. Since decisions are made in a split second, there are lots of opportunities for things to go wrong. The first is the mesh point with the fullback, where the quarterback has to decide if he's going to hand it off or keep it. A moment's hesitation can lead to disaster. If the quarterback decides to keep it, he must decide whether or not to pitch. But the nature of the option makes the pitch riskier than a pitch on something like a normal toss play. Unlike a toss play, the nature of an option play precludes the possibility of consistent timing. It's also incumbent on the quarterback and running back to maintain pitch relationship as the play develops, so that the quarterback is able to pitch whenever he sees fit. The nature of the triple option is high risk, but also high reward. OU didn't see much reward that day against Texas, but it didn't take long for the Sooners to move in the right direction. OU finished the season on a 4-1-1 run, the only loss in that stretch coming against eventual AP national champion Nebraska by 7 points. The end of 1970 set the stage for a remarkable 71 campaign. That season, the Sooners took off. With Mildren and Pruitt returning, the Sooners started the season hot. Through the first 3 games of the season, OU averaged 481 yards and 39 points a game, compared to only 335 yards and 21 points a game at the same time the previous year, prior to installing the Wishbone. Then, it was time for Texas, their first real test of the year. This would determine how effective their Wishbone had actually become. Greg Pruitt fumbled on Oklahoma's first drive, leading to a Texas score. But worries about the Wishbone were quickly dispelled as Oklahoma scored on its next drive. The teams traded touchdowns once again as the first quarter came to an end. Early in the second quarter, Mildren, with some nifty running and excellent decision-making, led the Sooners on a 10-play, 96-yard drive to give Oklahoma the lead. A lead they would never relinquish. Oklahoma ended up easily handling their southern rival 48-27, behind 205 rushing yards and 3 touchdowns from Greg Pruitt. The Sooners totaled 435 rushing yards that day, which actually turned out to be one of their lower outputs of the season. Oklahoma passed the test with flying colors and had Texas, of all people, to thank for it. Switzer applauded their sportsmanship. Emory was terrific. When you consider the nature of the situation, here was Texas, a blood rival, helping us out. It was an incredible thing for them to do. Ford would never give Chevrolet ideas on how to beat them at production or marketing, but Darrell and Emory, to their credit, helped us. And from that point on, we killed them. After 1970, Darrell Royal would never again beat Oklahoma. From 1971 to his final year in 1976, Royal would go 0-5-1 against Texas's arch-rival. Simply put, nobody could match Oklahoma's speed. In the 71 Cotton Bowl, the Irish stopped the bone by having their linebackers mirror Texas's running backs. That kind of defense wouldn't be nearly as effective against Oklahoma, whose running backs could outrun everyone else's linebackers. Texas may have introduced the Wishbone to college football, but Oklahoma showed them how to run it. Oklahoma would beat their next 5 opponents after Texas easily, including beating number 6 Colorado 45-17. On Thanksgiving Day, the Sooners welcomed the number 1 ranked Nebraska Cornhuskers to Norman, a showdown that was billed as the game of the century. And it lived up to its billing. The game was one of the purest ever played. By any measure, atmosphere, quality of play, excitement, the game of the century proved itself to be just that. Oklahoma rolled up 467 total yards to Nebraska's 362, but the Sooners fell 35-31. Neither team really stopped the other. It was a matter of which team had the ball last, and it happened to be Nebraska. As Greg Pruitt would put it, we didn't lose, we just ran out of time. After shellacking Oklahoma State 58-14, Oklahoma would accept an invitation to play in the Sugar Bowl against Auburn and Heisman-winning quarterback Pat Sullivan. It was no contest as OU rolled to a 31-0 halftime lead. The Sooners ultimately triumphed 40-22 in a game that wasn't as close as the score would seem to indicate. Jack Mildren became the first player in Sugar Bowl history to score 3 touchdowns in the game. The Sugar Bowl put the bow on an all-timer of a season for Oklahoma offensively. The Sooners had set an NCAA record for rushing yards per game with 472, a record that still stands today. They also set an NCAA record with 567 total yards in a single game. Greg Pruitt averaged 9.4 yards per carry, another NCAA record, while coming in second in the Heisman voting. Oklahoma averaged 45 points per game and 7.1 yards per play against quality competition. The Sooners played 5 teams ranked in the top 20, including the first and third ranked teams. Their only loss came by 4 to an all-time great Nebraska team. Oklahoma was back. The Sooners weren't the only blue blood to benefit from Texas's generosity. In the SEC, there was another powerhouse that had been struggling. Bear Bryant's Crimson Tide. By 1971, the Bear was already a legend, having won national championships in 1961, 1964, and 1965. From 1961 to 1966, the Tide lost a total of 5 games. But in the next 4 years, they'd lose a total of 15, including back-to-back 5-loss seasons. This negative trend had fans starting to suggest that maybe the Bear was washed up. It was time for him to step down. Before the 71 season, reporters would come by practice and see the Tide doing the same old stuff, running the I formation, which had gotten them absolutely nowhere over the past few years. They'd leave and write their stories, lamenting how difficult it would be to take on USC in the season opener. On September 10th, in the LA Coliseum, the Trojans took the field as the AP preseason number 5 team, while Alabama ranked a solid 16th. But when the Crimson Tide offense took the field, fans didn't see the I formation they had read about in the offseason. They saw the Wishbone. Bryant had seen what Texas had done in the Southwest Conference. His Crimson Tide had also taken on Oklahoma in the Bluebonnet Bowl at the end of 1970 and battled them to a 24-24 tie. He had seen what the Wishbone could do. Just like the fans, the Bear had known that something needed to change. So, in the spring of 1971, the Alabama staff had traveled to Austin to learn the offense. Upon their return, they began installing it in complete secrecy. During normal practice, they'd run the Wishbone, but when media members were present, they'd switch back to the pro-style offense they had run in previous years. Now, they would use the I on occasion during the upcoming season, but make no mistake, this was a Wishbone team. Coaches Royal and Ballard even came to Tuscaloosa that August to teach a coaching clinic on the bone without a soul knowing. Even in pregame warm-ups that day in the Coliseum, they ran their old offense. Nobody knew about the Wishbone until the Bama offense took the field for the first time. USC was shell-shocked. They had spent the offseason preparing for the I. Alabama quickly took a 17-0 lead behind 2 Johnny Musso touchdown runs. USC finally got their legs under them, and the teams went into the locker room with the Tide leading 17-10. A turnover-filled second half meant the game would end with that score, and the Tide went back to Tuscaloosa with the first notch on their belts of the Wishbone era. The rest of the regular season would be a cakewalk, as they would outscore opponents by an average of 27 points per game, including a 31-7 obliteration of 5th-ranked Auburn. All-American Johnny Musso led the team with 1,088 rushing yards and 16 touchdowns, while 4 other players totaled over 400 rushing yards apiece. They came into the Orange Bowl undefeated with a chance to win the national championship after consecutive 5-loss seasons. It did not go as planned, as the Cornhuskers manhandled the fledgling Wishbone team 38-6. And although the Tide lost to an all-timer of a Nebraska team in the Orange Bowl, they were well on their way to solidifying the Bears' legacy. The Tide had improved their win total by 5 in 1971. It's one thing to improve by 5 wins if you had 1 win the previous year, but to go from 6 wins to 11 is a quantum leap. Just like Oklahoma, Alabama was back.